All right, well, welcome everybody to Building Natural in Cold and Wet Climates. Today I will be your host. My name is Brett Little, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Green Home Institute. The Green Home Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit celebrating 15 years, and we exist to empower people to make healthier and more sustainable choices in the renovation and construction of the places we live. This course is brought to you by our main sponsors, Andersen Windows, CertainTeed, Saint-Gobain with their Air Renew, and check out Panasonic Whisper Green for all of your ventilation needs. So with that, I'm going to be handing it off to Siggy Coco here. I'm really excited to have her back doing this session again. This is the second time we've done this in a while, and we're always excited to help promote natural buildings. Up here in the Midwest, where I'm from, we do a lot of work around the Midwest cold climate regions where we have definitely have moisture issues within our buildings, and a lot of moisture that we have to take a look at. So it's certainly exciting when we can see projects utilizing more natural materials and that aren't having failures occurred. Typically what we see are people very skeptical of these building systems, and so we're more excited to help get the word out and promote these. And thanks to Siggy Coco of Down to Earth Design, who's going to be presenting on this topic today. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Brett, and thanks to everybody for joining in. Today we're going to learn a bit about how to approach whether you're building new or renovations, and do it in a way that uses natural materials to improve energy efficiency, use less energy generally, improve indoor air quality, and just overall sustainability. So with that, let us begin. And I'm going to do my best, just logistics-wise, regarding questions to address questions that are pertinent to whatever I'm talking about, and otherwise I'm going to sort of hold them till the end, I think. But I'll do my best to sort of integrate question answering. So if we're going to talk about improving overall sustainability, I just want to set a baseline for what that means to me. And I use the UN's definition, which is basically that we should live in a way and take actions that allow not only us to have a high quality of life, but to allow all future generations to have at least as high quality life as we have. And that means not degrading the environment in the process. So then defining what makes materials a natural building material, right? So there's lots of materials out there, there's products, there's materials in nature, and what exactly are the variables that make them natural building materials? And so here's sort of my short list. First and foremost, I think you look for materials that are available near you. So if you live in an area that does not have a lot of trees, then wood is not a sustainable material. It is natural, but it wouldn't be sustainable for you where you live. Similarly, there's some insulation materials that use pumice. Pumice is a naturally occurring rock where there's volcanic formations, but that's not available everywhere. So if it's not local to you, then that's not really natural. So something that is locally available, it's rapidly renewable, so it doesn't take 40 years to renew, it takes a season or a few seasons to renew. It's completely non-toxic, so no low toxicity, no low VOC, it's just not toxic. If you ate it, you wouldn't die. And it allows you to use appropriate technology and not necessarily just the highest technology that's available. And generally speaking, what happens when you look at natural materials is that they're more than one of these things. So they're locally available, and they're rapidly renewable, and they're non-toxic. So it's not just one or the other, it's usually multiple. And then what we're thinking about is a little paradigm shift. And the paradigm shift is typical construction is about 50% cost for materials and about 50% cost for labor. And natural building has a much higher labor cost, but much lower material cost. In the end, those equalize out, so your total cost at the end is about the same. However, what the opportunity offers is that you have these inexpensive materials, but labor-intensive processes. The process to build is very simple to learn, and so you have these opportunities for sort of that barn-raising concept or community building, which I think is one of the most exciting parts. But then getting to sort of the nitty-gritty of what we're trying to talk about, and I'm going to try to bust some of the myths about natural building and straw bale construction specifically. But the first really important concept to understand is the properties of materials. And specifically what I'm talking about is whether or not the materials are insulators or mass materials. And what that means. So an insulation material, whoops, not advancing, there we go. An insulation material takes energy from point A and slows down its transfer to point B. It's sort of the opposite of a conductor, right? A conductor, for example, a wire that you're trying to transmit energy through, takes energy from point A and sends it to point B as fast as possible, right? It's the sprinter in the race. An insulation material is like the turtle in the race. The insulation slows down the flow. The more insulation you have, the slower the heat transfer flows through, right? So that's why super insulating reduces your energy use, because you want to use an insulation material whenever you have on one side of a wall, you have one temperature, one desired temperature, and on the other side of the wall, you have a different temperature that you can't control. And whenever you have that condition, you want an insulator between those two spaces. So what does that mean? If you're trying to heat the inside and it's winter outside, you want an insulator between you and winter, right? And I think this is intuitive, but it's amazing to me how often this gets messed up. An example would be an energy efficient refrigerator. What did they do to refrigerators to make them more and more energy efficient? They added insulation to the outside. They also changed compressors and things like that. But the main thing is to increase the insulation so that the coolness inside the refrigerator stays cold with very little energy input. Meanwhile, the space outside, right, your house, your room, your kitchen, can be warm, and it doesn't make all of the ice cream melt, right? And same with an oven, right? So an oven can be 500 degrees, and you don't want that to make your kitchen 500 degrees. That would be unbearable. So the oven is insulated to keep that heat in for very little energy output and not heat your total space. So this means either the heating example, so when you're trying to keep warm during winter when it's cold outside. It also means if you are going to cool your space, so let's say you live in Florida or somewhere very warm, and you know you want to keep your inside 30 degrees cooler than what it is outside, then same thing, you want an insulator between you and the outside. So when we're talking about natural materials, the thing that makes a material an insulator is actually the little air pockets, right? So like the example from the sponsor that was cellulose. Cellulose is one of my favorite insulators, actually. When you're talking about the cellulose, it's not because it's newspaper. It's because they fluff it and there's little tiny air pockets between each flake of cellulose. And so straw and hemp are insulators because they're a tube, and even when you compress it, there's still a tube of air pockets. And those air pockets are what create the insulation. So pumice, for example, is a rock, and you don't necessarily think of a rock as being insulated, but pumice is sort of, expanded. So it has these little tiny air pockets inside the rock, and when you pick it up, it's very light. And same with cotton and wool, so those are fiber insulations, but they have air pockets in between, and those air pockets are what create the insulation. So how much insulation do you want? Or how much insulation do each of these materials provide? So for hemp and straw, you're usually talking about R2 to 3 per inch of thickness in the wall. The R value is the resistance to thermal flow. The higher the R value, the more insulating the material. Clay slip straw is sort of, I'll talk a little bit more about what that is, but has about 1.5 maximum R per inch, depending on how much clay you put in. And then things like wool and cotton in the fibers tend to be around 3 to 4, R3 to 4 per inch. So that gives you a sense of how much insulation value you can get per thickness of wall. So when I'm looking at insulating a building, right, so the more you insulate, the less energy you're going to use to stay comfortable regardless of what the temperature is outside. The most important one is the roof, because 60% of your heat gain and 60% of the heat loss is through the roof. So if you're doing a retrofit situation, that's where I start. It's often the least expensive to insulate as well, because if there's an attic, you can just insulate the bottom of the attic. So the code right now is, I believe it is R40. It's just changed to for the roof. I actually use R48 as a minimum for the roof insulation. Same with walls. The R value just bumped up to R20. I use R30 minimum. Straw bale walls, for example, when they're 18 inches thick, the minimum tested value is R36. So we've exceeded that wall insulation by quite a bit. And that's what makes a straw bale wall super insulating. And then obviously you want to insulate from either the ground temperature below you if you're talking about a slab, or a crawl space, so same thing. So the other piece to not forget about, which isn't really about the insulation, so it's easy to say, okay, well my walls are R36, so I'm covered. Yes and no, because the other place where you can have 15 to 25% of your heat loss is actually leakage between windows and doors in the wall, between framing members. There's all kinds of places where air can actually leak through. So what I recommend, and this would be true for a remodel as well, is how I determine where we start with a remodel, is to do a blower door test. It's a really simple test. You can often, depending on where you live, there can be funding for having that blower door test done for free or 50% off. But what you want to think about is, are there any little holes in your envelope? If your envelope is your whole outside of your building between you and the outside air, and you want to seal all those up, so that means weather stripping every door. It means making sure that you put caulking on bottom plates where they meet floor framing, making sure that framing where the window frame meets the wall has a good air barrier on it. And maybe the joint is also caulked. So the point being that that can also improve your energy usage substantially just by sealing any of those little gaps. So our second material type that we're talking about today is called thermal mass. And this one's a little harder to understand, but if you think of it like a battery, right? So instead of storing electrical energy, which is what batteries that we're all familiar with when we charge our phones, so a thermal mass is a battery that stores heat energy. And just like with a battery, what that means is if the mass, right, so the thermal mass, like in this case you're looking at a wall that's made out of cob, which is basically the same thing as adobe. but it's sculpted in place. So this is a clay-based wall system. And when that wall is warmer than the air around it, it releases heat. And when that wall is cooler than the air around it, it absorbs heat. It's just like a battery. If you plug in your battery and there's an excess of energy, that energy goes into the battery. So a thermal mass can be used to store heat energy, right? So in this case, like a large energy input. So let's say it's wintertime, you're trying to warm your space. You want to capture heat energy inside and store it. And so in this case, we have stone, which is a thermal mass, surrounding a fireplace, this is actually a masonry heater, which is a really, really efficient, high energy output firebox. And so when the fire is on, the fire goes on one time a day. It burns twice as hot as a normal fire, which means it releases more than twice the total energy potential of any piece of wood that's burned. So in a normal fire, you're burning just the solid fuel, so that's about 40% of the potential energy of the wood. The rest is creosote and gases. In a masonry heater, it burns twice as hot, and so it burns all of the sap and resins that are inside the wood, so you're getting much more energy out of every piece of wood that you burn. That energy then needs to be stored, and so the storage is the stone. And likewise, if you are living somewhere warm or it's summertime, that same mass can be used to store coolness. And that's sort of a weird concept to think about, but basically, if you have a mass wall that's shaded, so it has no energy input, right, no fireplace like in the last one, the sun's not going to hit it in the summertime, or it's in some other way it's shaded, then it is constantly pulling excess heat and humidity out of the air and pulling it into that thermal mass. And so it's sort of like a free natural cooling mechanism. A good example of that would be a cave, right? When you go into a cave, it's a constant 57 degrees. And the reason is it is the temperature of the ground below what is impacted by frost or sun or any other weather conditions. So when you use thermal mass is when you're trying to moderate your big swings in temperature. So maybe your daytime temperature is warm, but your nighttime temperature is cool. Then you can use high thermal mass, and it basically acts as a flywheel and comes to equilibrium between the day and the nighttime temperatures. The other way you can use it is to actually, like I was just describing, to absorb and then store the heat energy or create a cool bank. So it's a great use for a trom wall in passive solar design. So where you have a south-facing window that has low winter sun can come right through the window and hit this wall, and then it warms. And that's actually what you're looking at. This is a trom wall. And so the low winter sun comes through a big bank of windows that's to the left of this wall, and it warms up that mass in the wintertime. But in the summertime, the sun toward the south is very steep. And so it doesn't come through the windows at all, and that same exact wall is now storing coolness, basically, by absorbing excess heat in the house, heat and humidity, actually. And you can add mass to an existing building. So if you're not excluded from rent.
Siggy, are you still there?
So you can remodel an existing space by adding thermal mass, and that will improve the overall performance of the building. You can add evenly distributed mass in terms of plasters around the inside of a building, and that will just sort of moderate temperatures. Or you can add solar walls or put mass around heating systems like a wood-burning stove, things like that, and it will improve, it will reduce temperature modulation, so you won't have temperature swings inside, and it improves the overall comfort level of the space. The thing to think about if you're remodeling is if you build a mass wall, that mass wall has a lot of weight to it, and so you have to make sure that structurally you can support the mass. So examples of thermal mass materials include cob and adobe, which are basically the same material. It's clay, soil, sand that's either in the soil or added to it, and a little bit of straw that doesn't change the thermal mass properties but helps knit it all together. Adobe is made into bricks. Cob is sculpted in place, but it's literally the exact same material. Clay plasters and lime plasters, again, can be used to make evenly distributed thermal mass, so usually around 2 inches of plaster around an entire space will keep temperature inside very, very, very constant. If you're using, so rammed earth has a higher thermal mass because it's denser. So rammed earth is just clay and sand, and it's tamped, should be compacted. It actually, you turn it back into sedimentary stone. And if you're using a thermal mass material to create a solar wall, you usually want about 10 to 12 inches, depending on your placement and where you're located, what your climate region is. Again, for walls, you're usually talking about 2 inches, evenly distributed, well, 1.5 to 2 inches. And then if you're talking about floors or adding mass to a wood heater of some kind, you usually want between 4 and 6 inches total. If you have too much mass, your flywheel becomes so long that it becomes difficult to heat up a space. So for example, if you went on vacation for 2 weeks and you came home and it's 55 degrees inside and you want it to be 70, it's going to take a really long time for it to get back up to comfort if you have a ton of thermal mass. So those are about the numbers that keep you in balance. Sorry, skipped ahead of myself here. So the way that I use insulation and thermal mass is I use them both, always, all the time. So I use super insulation on the exterior, so and if there's any zones inside, I will insulate between the zones. But basically between you, whatever temperature space you're trying to create inside, and the outside, you want as much insulation as you can get. Prioritizing the roof. Second priority is the walls and air leakage, and then third priority is the floor. And then I use mass either as solar walls or around heating units, and I use evenly distributed plaster. So I use about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of evenly distributed plaster around the inside. So when you use them both together, you're actually maximizing performance because the mass as a plaster improves the insulation's dynamic R-value performance, so it's dynamic insulating properties. And if you're working with either a renovation or new construction and you're trying to apply passive solar principles, you absolutely need to understand insulation and thermal mass, because without insulation, you're not going to have a high-performing building, and without thermal mass, you're not going to have the ability to capture the sun in the wintertime. So I'm going to go back to a material that I talked about at the beginning, and hopefully this will make sense at this stage. So there's a material called light clay straw, which is a natural material where you take straw and you just coat it with enough clay to sort of make a glue and glue the straw together, sort of like oriented strand board, but with straw and clay. And that can be an insulator, so around roughly R1.5 per inch, if you don't use too much clay. So the clay, because it's a mass, will create a thermal bridge across the straw. So just as a side note, that when you're using natural materials, it's not like you go to Home Depot and you can look up the instruction manual online and you come home and you go to your project, your building construction site, and you know exactly how to install it and you know exactly what the materials are. This requires that you understand the materials. So natural building requires that you understand the properties of the materials so that you can use them appropriately. So our second really big important concept, and this is one of the myths about natural building, is that we need to understand water and how water works in a wall system. And the paradigm shift we're making here are breathable wall systems. And the two types of water that we need to understand are liquid water, right? That's the one that most people get, right? It rains, the snow melts, there's a pipe leak, there's liquid water, right? And the second is airborne moisture. And that one's a little bit harder to understand. But one of the myths about natural building, and in particular about straw bale construction, is that you can't use it in a wet climate. So, oh yeah, natural building's great, but I don't live in Arizona, so it's not an option for me. And that's just not the case. And if it were, I wouldn't have a job, but I've had a job for 20 years designing and building natural buildings in wet climates. And the bottom line is this, that wood is also a biodegradable material, just like straw is a biodegradable material. They're both cellulosic materials. And if we couldn't build with straw, if there was no way to build with straw in our wet climate, then we also couldn't build with wood. It biodegrades at the exact same conditions that straw will biodegrade. So just a reminder that we're talking about moisture, which is liquid water, and vapor, that is water suspended in air. And our first mantra, this is actually my first mantra with any building, regardless if it's natural building or not, right? So, and all of these moisture rules kind of apply to any building type. But the first mantra is to keep liquid water out. So addressing just liquid water. And so what we're going to think about primarily is rain and snow melt, and then a little bit with plumbing. So the first is looking at the base of your wall, and as water pours off of a roof and it splashes off the ground, is it going to hit the same section of wall every single time it rains and therefore create persistent moisture over time? And it's that persistent moisture over time, in other words, a wet spot that doesn't get a chance to dry out. That's when you have a problem, because at 18% or higher total moisture content in a biodegradable material, any biodegradable material, two things begin to happen. One is that the microbes that cause things to biodegrade become activated, and so they start digesting your cellulosic material and turning it into compost. And the second thing that happens is any mold spores, and they're everywhere, they're in the air, those mold spores will also bloom. And mold is a toxin inside, so especially if it builds up. So you want to not have moisture build up persistently over time. It needs to dry out, and it needs to not build up higher than 18% total moisture content. So we're protecting the base of the wall so that the splashback doesn't keep one section of the wall wet all the time. Then our second rule is to look at any potential penetrations, and that's the top of the wall and at windowsills. And the top of the wall, would be an issue if there's a roof leak, right? So if there's a roof leak and it can get inside a wall and you can't see that it's there, you don't, A, know that you have a roof leak, so you don't fix the problem. So it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And B, you don't know that you have water in your wall and it can build up to higher than that 18% moisture content. And voila, your wall starts to decompose or rot. And that's true for a wood wall as well. It's just more dramatic with a straw wall. So what we do is we provide, you can see here in this photo that there's some roofing felt over the windowsill. We do the same thing at the tops of the wall, so that should water come down and hit the horizontal surface of the wall, it has to shed to the sides and go into the plaster, which means two things. One, you've protected the middle of your wall, and two, you've just stained your plaster with whatever that water is. So now you see that there's a problem, and if it's a roof leak, you fix that roof. And our third rule is to look at roof overhang and make sure that we're providing deep roof overhang so that the water that comes off of the roof comes way far away from the building, not right against the building. And that's for the same reason that we have rule number 1. Our fourth rule, and I don't think I have it in here, is, or our other rule related to this is plumbing. And the rule with plumbing is I don't put any plumbing lines ever, regardless of what the wall type is, in exterior walls. And the reason is that that's the one place where your plumbing can freeze. And so why take out insulation, put in this thing that could freeze, and potentially have a burst pipe inside your exterior wall? So the solution with plumbing is just to eliminate that condition completely. So our second mantra regarding moisture is addressing that airborne vapor. And what we want to do here is keep it airborne, right? We want it to stay airborne and travel freely. If it's always airborne, it can never build up to higher than that 18% moisture content. So this leads us to rule number 4, which is to avoid condensation points inside the walls. And condensation points are created when you have an ambiently cold material inside an ambiently warm material. So what does that mean? So straw, when you touch it, even if it's winter time, it feels warm to the touch. I mean, not warm, it's winter. But it doesn't make you feel like, oh, my hand's going to stick to it, it's freezing cold. Versus metal, if you touch it, even when it's kind of cold, you touch metal and it feels freezing. And so what happens is that airborne moisture hits that cold surface and it actually condenses and turns into liquid water. And now we have our first problem. We have liquid water inside our wall, and if it never condensed, it would have just traveled freely. So no metal inside the walls. And the example of this is if you have a glass of ice water on a table. In the middle of the summertime when it's very humid outside, you can actually have the humidity from the air condenses on the outside of the glass, and the outside of the glass becomes wet. And it's obviously not because there's little tiny pinholes in the glass, it's just from that airborne moisture condensing on the outside of that cold surface. And our rule number 5 is probably the most important and the easiest to goof on. And that is to use breathable finishes. So this means every single surface that goes on top of your wall, and this is true, this is an easy one to do with renovations, is that all finishes should be breathable finishes. Breathable being not literally that air flows through them, but breathable meaning that that humidity, the moisture that's found in the air, that's actually evaporated in the air, can travel through the finish freely without getting blocked. So think Gore-Tex, right, where it's water repellent, but it's vapor breathable, so you don't get hot and sweaty inside your Gore-Tex jacket. And this means we're looking at our plasters, we're looking at all the paints, we're looking at any clear sealers. Anything that goes on the wall should be breathable. So just to sort of wrap up then, and we can leave some time for questions. I just want to summarize. So what we're talking about is using clay or mass-based materials to absorb excess heat, and that means either excess heat in the air in the summertime, right, and create that natural cooling effect, or absorbing solar heat in the wintertime so that you get free heat inside, or any other heat source in the wintertime, be it a wood-burning stove or any other kind of fire heat. And then we're also using clay-based materials specifically to moderate humidity, which improves your comfort level in the summertime. So when air is less humid, it feels more comfortable, or you have the same level of comfort at a higher temperature. So picture Arizona at 90 degrees feels more comfortable than Pennsylvania, where I live, at 80 degrees and 100% humidity. Even though it's hotter in Arizona, it feels more comfortable because it's not humid. And the clay has a unique capacity to absorb that excess humidity. And finally, that clay gives you that breathable finish property. And then we use straw materials or cellulosic materials. So that includes blown-in cellulose, that includes cotton, that includes wool, which isn't cellulosic but is insulating, to insulate everywhere. So again, focusing first on your roof. So what, putting the hat on in the wintertime. But you don't want to put a hat on and then go outside in a bikini. So you also insulate your walls. And then looking at any air leakages, like going outside and not zipping up your coat, right? And when we do both of those things, we create really energy efficient buildings. And I'm going to leave you with my sort of mantra, my other mantra, my life mantra from Gandhi. And then I'm happy to do any questions. I assume I would see them in the chat box if there are.
Hey everybody, yeah, thanks for tuning in here. Start throwing your questions into the chat box. Siggy, I did see a couple of them. I'm assigning them your way right now if you see them populating. Actually, there seems to be one question or two questions revolving around calculations on temperature swing. Do you see those coming your way?
I see a note about calculating temperature swing, but I'm not sure what the question is.
Let's see. Yeah, well, maybe you could quick speak to ways to calculate, if there's any kind of calculation tools. And that even might be a good question. Any kind of calculation tools people can use, for thermal mass.
Oh, okay. So there's whole books written on that. I can tell you my favorite book on it, but like it's more complicated than me just talking in a webinar. But my favorite book is, let me get the title right. Okay. I can't find it really quickly, but I think it's called the Passive Solar House Book, but the author is Ed Mazaria, M-A-Z-R-I-A, and it explains everything that you need to understand about thermal mass for passive solar design. As a rule of thumb, let's do a rule of thumb. So if you're creating a mass wall that has good solar access in winter and zero solar gain in summer, if you make that wall usually between 10 and 12 inches thick in the colder regions of the U.S., not the extreme cold, I would say, and probably not Canada, although I don't understand the Canadian climate from personal experience, you may need more mass in the colder climates. You also need 4 hours of solar gain on that wall for it to work. If you're using mass on a wood heater, usually the rule of thumb is 4 to 6 inches maximum. Because if you use more mass and you go away for a period of time, it takes several fires to recharge that battery. So it can be less efficient. I'm not sure if that answered it.
No, thanks. I think that was definitely helpful. Here's a question from Bill, and this is actually in line with a question I have too. So really, the question is wondering if interior materials, what to do if they do get wet and hold moisture, and that kind of connects with a question I had as far as you were talking about the thermal mass or trom wall in the summertime taking in moisture out of the air. So what happens to all that moisture, as interiors get wet in these homes?
So clay will just dry back out again, right? So clay, picture it's like a sponge, but it's a sponge that can hold so much water. So a clay material, you're not really worried about it. I mean, you don't want it wet, and then actually the water's acting as a mass, and if you're trying to use it to warm up the whole house, it would need to dry out before it's actually working as a warmed mass material. But if it's straw, it depends. So the rule of thumb is the outside or inside, so the external 3 to 4 inches can get wet and will dry back out again. If the middle of the wall gets wet, it's very difficult for it to dry back out. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. So it kind of depends on what exactly happened. So with straw, you really want to avoid it getting wet, period, if you can. And then depending on how wet it gets, if it gets wet enough and stays wet and doesn't start drying out within, I would say within a month, it will start to degrade in the wall, and then you're in a situation where you need to pull those bales out and put in new bales. But that's not as hard as it sounds. So, for example, I had a project where the straw bales under 2 7-foot-long windows got wet because of some improper detailing on the window on the outside. So the sill on the outside tipped in toward the window, and so it was, whenever it rained, it was pouring rainwater inside the wall. And so it took about 5 years, but then the section of straw bale that was right under the windows rotted out. And so we replaced both of those 7-foot windows in one day and had a base coat of plaster on them the same day. So it's not a horrible, horrible job to replace, but there are situations where if it's straw, you may have to replace the wall system.
Great, thanks. Could you please give a little more information on the detail of where you would actually run the plumbing lines?
Inside walls. So floor systems, inside wall, like any uninsulated cavity.
Oh, you mean interior walls? Right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I like literally. It doesn't matter if it's an entry building or not. I won't run a plumbing line on an outside wall.
Yeah, that's definitely typically a lot of the green building programs too. Either start to require that you can't do that anymore. So, for many reasons.
Yeah, because you're just placing insulation for something that could freeze. So now you have the least amount of insulation next to the thing that's the most vulnerable.
So this is a funny question. The question is, how do you protect the home from mice? But stepping back and looking at a integrated pest management, and with green building, typically there's pest management strategies that people want to utilize. So for a building like this, what are some of the pest management strategies that you use?
Yeah. So the main thing is that with a cavity wall system, you have framing and then a space in between with fluffy bedding, right, for a mouse. So a mouse comes in and they look at that and they're like, oh, this is great. They have this nice little fluffy insulation and they can make themselves a nice little home. But with a straw bale wall, you have a solid wall system and it's plastered on both sides. So for a mouse to even get in there, they'd have to dig through the plaster and you would see that. And then they would have to burrow into the straw and you would see that. Like the straw has to go somewhere, so it would come out and there'd be a pile and you would see that they're there. So it's really not the same kind of issue that you have with a cavity wall system. So mice are typically not a problem. They're usually, when there's mice present, they're in framed walls, not the straw walls. And certainly for clay-based walls, there's literally nowhere for them to go and there's no food. So they have no desire to dig into a clay wall.
Thanks. Here's a question from Bill. He's preparing to build an outdoor mud cob oven. He'll be using recycled concrete, catch basin, 4x4 as a base, and will hold firewood. He'll be using a mud sculpt over that, but wondering about the oven itself. What is the best material in your experience, clay, straw, or something else?
I'm not sure I understand the question. To build the oven itself or to build the basin? Like to build the base that it's all going to sit on? Can Bill repost some more specifics? And also I'll say I have on my blog, which you can get to from my website, which is buildnaturally.com, and if you go right to the top and click the big orange B, you'll go to my blog and there's a whole complete step-by-step cob oven article there that literally explains everything you could possibly need to know about a cob oven. But if we're just talking about the sort of mass versus insulation of the oven itself, then you want the firebox to be mass. So you want it to be clay and sand. So that would be basically a cob mixture. And then around that, so just like with a regular oven, you insulate the oven to keep the heat in. So same thing. Then around that, you want a high insulator. And so there I use the slip straw, which is basically straw with just enough clay to coat it and sort of glue it all together and put that around the outside of the mass. And so then you have mass plus insulator equals super high-performing oven.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. He was just saying, yeah, the oven will sit on the base. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
It looks like somebody is building a straw bale house, and the builders connected the wood frame with the metal connectors in brackets there. Is that deadly dangerous, or because straw bales are covered with clay, the condensate will not stay in?
If the metal is inside the wall, and if the metal is in contact with the straw, then yes, it's absolutely a problem. So there needs to be something on that metal that prevents it from being cold. And this is not a natural solution, but something like expandable foam that goes over the metal that is closed cell and can't have moisture go through it, so you can't have condensation against the metal. But yeah, if the metal's inside the wall, it's definitely a problem.
Looking at how do these homes handle moisture from bathrooms, showers, cooking, dishwashers, etc.?
Yeah, so actually that's a great question, and they handle it better than a typical house. And the reason, so when I was talking about clay materials and how they help absorb humidity, so, and I think the example I was primarily using was if it's summertime and it's humid, the humidity is part of what creates your discomfort, right? It's what makes it feel hot and sticky. The sticky part is the humidity. So I was talking about the clay being able to absorb that excess humidity, and then whenever it's dry again, it releases the humidity. So, and it can do that on a seasonal cycle, which means on a daily cycle, which is what you have in a bathroom, it can easily handle, so a clay plaster or a lime plaster can easily handle the humidity from a bathroom, a shower, cooking, all of that, and it absorbs the excess humidity and then slowly releases it whenever the air is less humid. So it's not an issue at all. So one of the big differences that people notice right off the bat is they take a shower and they get out of the shower and they look in the mirror and it's not foggy because the clay plasters have absorbed the humidity from the shower the entire time you were in the shower.
Have you done any, I guess, monitoring to see if that keeps the humidity sort of in that sweet spot of, what, around 40-ish throughout the year?
I haven't monitored it, but
Yeah.
the indicators would be mold and mildew, right? So if they were not moderating the humidity, if they were creating a moisture buildup, then you would end up with mold and mildew inside the bathrooms. And in 20 years, I've yet to have a bathroom that has an issue with mold or mildew.
There's still a couple of questions coming in. We're coming on 1 o'clock, but that's okay with me if you don't mind sticking around for a little bit, Siggy.
No, I'm happy to.
Okay. For those of you looking for continuing ed here too, those of you listening on demand, there'll be a quiz at the end of this. And then for those of you trying to get it for the live session, just stick around for another second. There'll be another slide and a quick poll for you all. So I'm back on the metal topic. I think this was in reference to keeping metal away. What about screws when connecting the wood frame?
So, I almost want to back up and talk structure a little bit. So the first rule of thumb is, when I was talking about the other question about what do you do if the wall does get wet, and that issue with a straw bale wall specifically, when it's the inside and the outside 3 to 4 inches, if those get some moisture, they will dry back out again, as long as it's not, a dripping pipe or something like that. So if it's on the inside or the outside 3 to 4 inches, you don't need to stress about screws or small bits of metal here and there. That's not a problem at all. It's the middle, basically 10 to 12 inches, the middle of the bale that can't dry back out again. A clay wall will dry back out, so if it got wet, because it wants to be at equilibrium both for moisture and temperature. But a straw bale wall has a very difficult time drying back out in the middle, especially at the bottom of the wall. So I don't usually have anything with screws or anything that's inside the center, inside that 10 to 12 inch middle. So screws are not really an issue because they're going to be toward the inside or the outside of the wall, unless I'm completely misunderstanding your question. Does that answer it?
I'm just waiting here to see if there's another response. Yep, got the answer. Thanks.
Okay.
Roof, attic insulation. What's your strategy with that?
So your sponsor is going to love my answer, because my favorite roof insulation is to insulate the bottom flat section of an attic insulation with really thick cellulose. That's my favorite, because cellulose, and this is speaking for the U.S., so cellulose in the U.S. is always local, it's always 100% recycled, and the only additive is borax, which is a non-toxic mineral. So you can't get much greener than that, in terms of that definition of what is sustainable. It's local, it's renewable because it's 100% post-consumer recycled content, and it's non-toxic.
Well, so that's the insulation. What about air sealing the attic then? Because typically we always see a layer of foam, and then people throw the cellulose on top of that, like a flash.
Yeah, I mean, I probably have 25 different roof systems in terms of structure versus insulation that I use. So it really depends, but really my favorite is just the cellulose. And if it's dense packed cellulose, and usually you're putting something on top of it so you can walk around or put storage in the attic. So usually there's, plywood or wood planking or something above that. I don't really do more than that except caulk everything, so caulk all the joints so that you're not having air leakage come through.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Have you seen anybody? Well, so I've talked to a couple of people here, up looking at building these types of projects in the north, and looking at insulations, particularly to add to the exterior wall. Have you heard of anything about that, or have any recommendations if people are trying to get a little more R value out of their walls in colder climates?
So again, I'm using straw bale for my exterior walls, and the lowest tested R value, and that was for a wall that was poorly constructed, the lowest tested R value for an 18-inch thick straw bale wall with no plaster on it was R36. So that's pretty good to me. So no, I don't try to add to that. The walls are fine. The walls are not a problem. The trick is getting the roof commensurate with the walls. So getting the roof a high enough R value so that you haven't now created a weak point at the top, right? So it's like going outside and having a great coat on but no hat, or a cotton hat instead of a wool hat.
Right.
Yeah, so that's way more the issue to me is the top, not the walls. You're
Sure.
covered with the walls.
That makes sense. From a remodeling standpoint, have you ever, I guess, seen anyone completely be able to gut out their home and add in straw bale, add in thermal mass, and
Yeah.
be able to make the entire home like that from a gut standpoint?
Yeah, for sure. So the trick with straw is that, so east of the Mississippi, I'm told straw bales are 18 inches wide and 14 inches tall. And if you put them flat versus put them so with the 18-inch width, or you put them on edge, so you have the 14-inch wide wall, you have the exact same R value. And the reason is that when you lay them flat, the straw is oriented in to out. And so you have actually better thermal flow through, because you're paralleling the orientation of the straw. When you tip it so that the straw is oriented up and down, now the air flow is perpendicular to the orientation of the straw. And so it's slightly slower, and so your total R value is actually exactly the same. But you've just saved 4 inches in your wall system. And usually with a retrofit situation like that, the issue is that you're going from a 3.5, 5.5 inch wall to a 14 to 18 inch thick wall. And so can you afford to lose that additional foot of space inside the house? That's usually the moderating factor, is the space. So one trick is to tip them up on edge and get your 14 inches. And you can put the straw in between studs, or you can leave studs exactly where they are and tie the straw bale wall back to the studs and leave the cavity. So either way works. There's a group called, I'm going to get their name a little bit wrong, I think, but it's New Frameworks Timber Framers in Vermont. And they do a system where they have studs, dense packed cellulose in between the studs, and then the straw on the inside. And they're getting really, really, really high R value for their walls. And they're in Vermont, which is why they're looking at really high R values. So if you're talking about cold areas in Michigan or somewhere like that, then that's probably the system I would recommend. And then in terms of mass, the easiest way to add mass is really thick plaster everywhere. Because again, if you're trying to add a wall or a floor, you need to make sure that the structure can support the load that you're adding on.
And I've heard that doing a thick plaster done right can air seal the home pretty well, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, without compromising breathability.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, Siggy, we're about 10 minutes over here, and I don't see any other questions. So why don't you just real quick to wrap up, let everyone know where they can get a hold of you and find more information.
Oh, well, that would be my website. That would be buildnaturally.com. If you're on Facebook, I also post something, little tidbits of natural building inspiration and information every single day on Facebook. You can link to there from buildnaturally.com as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Siggy Coco. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Those of you listening on demand, there'll be a quick quiz to get your CAUs after this. Those of you here live, stick around real quick for a poll. Thanks for everyone for joining us. Thanks to Siggy. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, Brett.
Hey, actually, another question did come in. If you see that in there.
About the foundation?
Yeah, about the foundation.
So I didn't cover foundations because it's not about the performance of the building. But my favorite foundation system is called a rubble trench footer. And if you Google that, I have tons of information, including a complete how-to, step-by-step, here's how to do it for rubble trench foundations.
Okay, thanks.
Can I take the quiz?
Yeah, for those of you who need to see that link with also your teachers, this is green and yeah, did I get those questions right?
Yeah, I think so.
And anyone who's taking this quick poll, if you don't have your AIA, just ignore those questions. And don't think you have to get these answers right to get your continuing ed. We're just got a quick poll to see what you all learned.
Excellent.
Are you the first one to have finished it?
Oh, I didn't really do it.
Oh, okay. I thought you were taking the quiz.
No, I was going through the questions to see if there were any other questions. There is one more question. Do you want me to address it?
Yeah, if they're still here, feel free to answer. I'm going to go step away for 1 second.
So it was a follow-up question to the question about what my favorite roof insulation is. And just to be clear, there's lots of different roof insulations. That just happens to be my favorite one. So when that works, that's what I use. When there's no attic space, I think was the question, what do I use? And I am very conservative, and so I actually go non-natural, and I maximize insulation with a blown-in closed cell insulation material. Well, it doesn't have to be closed cell, but and I give preference to soy-based insulations, but sometimes those are very, very expensive and a little bit tricky to use. There is a company, I want to say they're in Germany, that has created a detail for a panelized straw bale insulation. The trick is your roof is going to be cold in winter, and so therefore you are going to inherently have humidity rising through the straw, which is no problem, but when it hits that cold roof, it's going to condense and drip water back onto the straw, and then you have wet straw, and that is a problem. And so the tricky detail that I have not been able to resolve adequately, but other people feel that they have, is how to create basically a baffle system underneath the cold roof so that condensation drips into the baffle and runs out instead of dripping down into the straw and wetting the straw. But that's one where I'm so conservative with durability issues that I have not yet done a roof in line with the roof with straw insulation.
That'll be the next one, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, so actually I want to do an experiment, build my own little experimental building. And that's one of the things that I want to do so I can test it over time and develop a system that I feel really comfortable with.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead. Poll is closing here, so if anybody wasn't able to access it, please just send me a quick email and we'll get you guys set up. So, all right, Siggy. Well, I gotta head out here and grab some lunch. But thanks for all your time. I'll send you over the link to the recording if you want to access it, and keep up the good work.
Super. Thanks so much, Brett. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.